Most people will walk past you in a city of 8 million unless you give them a reason to stop, and that was something 12-year-old Ava Johnson had learned long before she understood why it hurt so much to be invisible. She sat on a piece of flattened cardboard near the edge of a busy Chicago train station, the wind cutting through the streets at nearly 20 miles per hour, pushing cold air into every corner. It found her fingers were numb, but she kept them tucked inside the sleeves of an oversized jacket that used to belong to her mother. People rushed by holding coffee cups and phones, stepping around her without ever meeting her eyes, as if she were just another shadow painted onto the sidewalk. Ava had been there since early morning, counting the small pile of aluminum cans beside her, hoping it would be enough to get something warm to eat before night fell. But hunger had become something she no longer complained about. It was just part of the background noise of her life, like the rumble of trains and the distant sirens that never seemed to stop. She watched a little girl about her age walk past, holding her father's hand, laughing about something that sounded light and easy. And for a moment, Ava let herself imagine what that felt like, to belong somewhere safe, to know someone would come looking for you if you disappeared. Then the moment passed, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, reminding herself that wishing did not change anything, only moving forward did. Her mother had always said you cannot control how people see you, but you can control who you are when no one is watching, and Ava held on to that like it was the only rule that still made sense. As the sky turned a dull gray and the temperature dropped, she stood up to stretch her legs and moved toward the alley beside the station, a place most people avoided because it was quieter, darker, easier to ignore. That was when she saw him, a man slumped against the brick wall, dressed in a coat that looked expensive even in the dim light, his breathing slow, his hand resting awkwardly near a cracked phone on the ground. People had already passed by him too, some glancing quickly before turning away, deciding it was not their problem. Ava hesitated for a second, the cold biting deeper into her skin, the small voice in her head telling her to keep walking because she had nothing to give and no one would thank her anyway. But then she remembered her mother's words again, and something inside her refused to let her move. She stepped closer, kneeling down beside the stranger, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he could hear her. And in that quiet moment, when the rest of the city kept moving like he did not exist, Ava Johnson made a choice that would change everything. The air in the alley felt even colder as Ava Johnson knelt beside the stranger, noticing how shallow and uneven his breathing had become, like he was trying to hold on to consciousness with nothing but effort and willpower. She leaned in slightly, unsure if he could even hear her voice, but speaking anyway in the softest tone she could manage, asking if he was okay, even though she already knew the answer was no. Her hands hovered for a moment before she carefully adjusted his coat to keep the cold wind from reaching him. It was heavier than anything she owned, but she did not think about that. She only thought about keeping him warm for the next few minutes. The man's eyes fluttered open slowly, unfocused at first, as if he was trying to understand where he was. And when they finally settled on her face, there was a brief pause of confusion followed by something quieter, something closer to surprise. He tried to speak, but his voice came out weak and uneven, forcing him to stop and take a breath before trying again. Ava stayed still, not rushing him, just staying close enough that he would know he was not alone. Around them, the city continued to move as if nothing important was happening. Footsteps echoed past the alley entrance. Distant conversations faded in and out, but no one stopped. No one looked in. It was as if this small pocket of the city did not exist to anyone except her. She noticed his hand was trembling slightly, and instinctively, she looked around for anything she could use. Spotting an old discarded cloth near a trash bin, she quickly reached for it, brushing off the dust before gently placing it under his head to make him more comfortable. It was not much, but it was something. The man's breathing steadied just a little as time passed, and with that small change, Ava felt a quiet relief she could not explain. She had learned long ago not to expect miracles, but she also knew that sometimes survival was made of small moments stacked together. She sat back on her heels for a second, rubbing her hands together to bring back feeling into her fingers, watching him carefully in case he needed anything else. His eyes stayed open now, tracking her movements slowly, as if he was trying to figure out who she was and why she had not left like everyone else. The silence between them felt heavier than the cold, not uncomfortable, but full of questions that neither of them were ready to answer. Ava glanced toward the entrance of the alley where the bright lights of the street flickered in contrast to the shadowed space where they were. People passed by just a few feet away without ever knowing what was happening here, and for a brief moment she wondered what would happen if she had walked past him too, if she had chosen the easier path like everyone else. But the thought disappeared as quickly as it came because the man shifted slightly, trying again to speak, this time managing a faint sound that almost formed into words, and Ava leaned in closer so she would not miss a single one, unaware that this simple decision to stay would soon pull her into a moment she could never have imagined. The stranger's voice finally broke through the silence, weak and uneven, as if every word cost him effort he could barely afford, and Ava Johnson leaned closer without hesitation, making sure she did not miss anything he was trying to say. But what she heard was not a request for help or even a clear explanation, just fragments of thought that faded in and out like distant signals. He paused often, closing his eyes for a moment before forcing them open again, and each time he looked at her, there was a growing sense of recognition, as if her presence meant more than she could possibly understand. Ava stayed calm, nodding slightly to encourage him to continue, even though she had no idea who he was or why his words carried such weight. Around them, the alley remained quiet except for the distant rhythm of the city just beyond its entrance. Headlights passing, faint voices, the steady sound of life continuing without interruption. She adjusted her position carefully, keeping herself between him and the cold draft that slipped through the narrow space, noticing how his breathing improved slightly whenever she stayed closer, as if her presence alone was helping him hold on a little longer. The man attempted to lift his hand toward the cracked phone lying nearby, but stopped halfway, too weak to complete the motion. Ava noticed and gently moved it closer within reach without saying anything. He stared at the phone for a moment, but did not pick it up. Instead, his gaze returned to her face and lingered there as if searching for something familiar. Ava felt a strange heaviness in the air, not fear but something harder to define, like standing on the edge of a moment that had not yet revealed its meaning. She quietly asked if he needed water or if there was someone she could call, but he did not answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly and shook his head just slightly, signaling no in a way that felt less like refusal and more like exhaustion. Ava accepted that without pushing further, understanding that sometimes people needed silence more than questions. She shifted her attention briefly toward the entrance of the alley where the light from the street flickered across wet pavement, a reminder that the world outside was still moving fast and indifferent. She wondered how long she had been there already and whether anyone had noticed her absence from the usual corner where she collected cans. But that thought quickly faded as the man finally spoke again, this time more clearly, asking her why she had not left like the others. The question hung in the cold air between them, simple but heavy, and Ava did not answer immediately because she was not sure there was a simple answer to give. Instead, she looked at him and said quietly that leaving someone alone did not feel like the right thing to do. The man closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing her words, and when he opened them again, there was a subtle shift in his expression, something softer, something almost like relief mixed with disbelief. Ava did not notice the deeper meaning behind his reaction. She only knew that he was still there, still breathing, still alive, because she had chosen to stop. And in that quiet realization, she could not have known that this moment was already moving towards something far bigger than either of them could see. The moment Ava Johnson finished speaking, the silence in the alley shifted in a way she could not explain, as if the air itself had grown heavier with meaning. The stranger exhaled slowly, and for the first time his expression softened, not from weakness, but from something closer to acceptance. He studied her face carefully, as if trying to memorize it. Not in a rushed way, but with the quiet attention of someone who had suddenly found something important in a place he never expected. Ava noticed this, but did not fully understand it. She only adjusted her position again, brushing her hands together to warm them, staying close enough to make sure he remained comfortable. The cold wind continued to slip through the narrow alley, but it no longer felt as sharp as before, or perhaps she was simply getting used to it. The man shifted slightly, his coat rustling against the ground, and Ava instinctively helped him sit up a little more, supporting his back with steady hands even though her arms were beginning to ache. He did not resist her help. Instead, he allowed it, as if trusting her more than he trusted his own strength in that moment. A few seconds passed before he spoke again, this time more clearly, asking her name. Ava hesitated only briefly before answering, her voice calm but cautious, as she was not used to strangers asking her anything personal in a tone that sounded sincere. The man repeated her name softly, as if confirming it in his memory, then fell silent again, looking away toward the opening of the alleyway. The city lights painted faint reflections on the wet ground. Ava followed his gaze for a moment, noticing how life outside continued without pause. People walking past, cars moving, conversations blending into a distant hum, none of them aware of what was happening just a few steps away. She looked back at him and asked if there was someone she should contact, maybe a family member or a friend, but the question seemed to weigh on him. He took a longer pause this time before slowly shaking his head, not in refusal, but in something that felt like distance, as if the idea itself belonged to another world. Ava did not press further. She had learned that not every silence needed to be filled. Sometimes just being present was enough. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bottle of water she had been saving, offering it to him carefully. He accepted it with slightly trembling hands and took a few small sips before handing it back. His breathing steadied a little more after that, and Ava noticed the change even though it was subtle. She sat down beside him again, keeping her posture relaxed so he would not feel pressure to speak. A few minutes passed like that, both of them sitting in a quiet balance between uncertainty and presence. The man finally broke the silence again, asking her what she was doing there so late at night. Ava looked down for a moment before answering honestly, explaining that this was where she usually stayed, where she felt safest even if it was not truly safe at all. Her words were simple, without complaint, just fact, and the man seemed to absorb them slowly, as if each detail carried more weight than it should. He looked at her again, this time with a different kind of focus, one that suggested he was no longer only seeing the moment, but something beyond it, something connected to a much larger story neither of them had spoken about yet. And Ava, still unaware of what was forming in the distance, simply continued to sit beside him, not knowing that everything was about to change. The silence between Ava Johnson and the stranger did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavier in a different way, like something unseen was slowly gathering around them without either of them understanding why. Ava stayed seated beside him, keeping her hands folded to stop them from shaking in the cold, watching as his breathing gradually became more stable than before. The change was small but noticeable, enough for her to feel a quiet sense of relief she did not fully trust. The man turned his head slightly toward her again, his eyes clearer now, though still carrying fatigue, and he studied her as if trying to understand a decision that did not make logical sense to him. Ava noticed the way he looked at her, but did not comment on it. She had learned that not every stare needed a response. Sometimes people were just trying to figure out how something unexpected could exist. She adjusted her position again, leaning her back lightly against the brick wall to take pressure off her legs, the cold surface pressing through her jacket, but she ignored it. Her focus remained on him. The stranger let out a slow breath and asked her a question that seemed simple but carried a deeper weight. He asked if she had always been alone. Ava hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she rarely said it out loud. After a brief pause, she nodded slightly and said that she had been on her own for a long time. The words came out without emotion, not because she did not feel anything, but because she had learned to speak about her life in a way that did not invite pity. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the ground as if processing something internally. Then he slowly asked another question, whether anyone ever looked out for her. Ava almost smiled, but it was not a happy smile, more like a reflex of memory. She shook her head gently, saying that people usually did not stop for her. They passed by quickly, sometimes not even seeing her at all. As she spoke, she kept her voice steady, not allowing bitterness to surface. The man listened without interruption, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression, not just curiosity, but something closer to concern mixed with disbelief. He seemed to struggle with the idea that someone could live so close to so many people and still feel invisible. Ava glanced toward the street again, where headlights moved across wet pavement and distant voices blended into the night. Everything outside the alley continued as if nothing unusual was happening. She turned back to him and noticed that he was trying to sit up a little more on his own now. Still weak, but more aware than before, she instinctively reached out to steady him, and he accepted the support without hesitation, as if her presence had already become a point of stability he did not want to lose. A few seconds of silence passed between them again, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was reflective. The man finally spoke again, his voice lower but clearer than before, saying that most people would have walked away without a second thought. Ava looked at him directly and simply said that she was not most people. The answer was not dramatic, not proud, just factual, but it seemed to affect him more than she realized. He looked away for a moment, then back at her, and there was something shifting in his expression, something like understanding beginning to form, as if he was starting to see that this moment was not random, that it was connected to something larger neither of them had reached yet. Ava, unaware of what was coming, only continued to sit beside him, not knowing that the quiet choice she had made was already setting something much bigger into motion. The night in the alley felt quieter now, not because the city had stopped, but because Ava Johnson and the stranger had become a small world of their own inside it. She remained seated beside him, her shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, while he leaned more steadily than before, his breathing no longer as fragile as it had been earlier. There was still weakness in his posture, but also a growing awareness in his eyes, as if each passing minute was pulling him further back into clarity. Ava noticed how he kept looking at her hands whenever she moved, as if trying to understand what kind of person would stay in a place like this for someone she did not know. She did not ask about it. She simply stayed present, because presence was something she understood better than questions. The man finally broke the silence again, his voice slow but more controlled now, asking her what she wanted from life. The question caught her slightly off guard because it was not something people usually asked her. Ava looked down at the ground for a moment, tracing a small line in the dust with her finger before answering honestly that she did not really think that far ahead anymore. Her life had become about getting through each day, finding enough to eat, finding somewhere safe enough to sleep. Surviving the next morning was already a kind of plan for her. The man listened carefully without interrupting, and there was a subtle tightening in his expression as if the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than he expected. He turned his head slightly toward the entrance of the alley again, where the city continued its endless movement, then back to her, and asked if she ever went to school. Ava shook her head gently and said she used to, but not anymore. She did not explain further because there was not much to explain. Life had simply moved in a direction where school was no longer part of it. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if absorbing that information, then opened them again with a look that felt different from before, less distant, more grounded. He shifted slightly and carefully reached for the edge of his coat, adjusting it around himself more properly, and Ava instinctively helped him without being asked, their movements now familiar in a quiet way, like two people who had learned how to share a space without words. After a few seconds he spoke again, this time more slowly, saying that most people in his experience would have expected something in return for helping someone. Ava looked at him directly and replied that she did not know what most people expected. She only knew what felt right in the moment. The answer seemed to stay with him longer than his previous thoughts. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stared forward into the dim light of the alley, as if something inside him had shifted into place. Ava followed his gaze briefly, then leaned back slightly against the wall again, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her body but not allowing herself to fully relax. There was still uncertainty in the air, but it no longer felt like danger. It felt like something waiting. The man finally spoke again, quieter this time, almost to himself, saying that the world had a way of ignoring the people who mattered most. Ava did not answer, because she did not know how to respond to something that sounded both true and unfair at the same time. Instead, she simply stayed where she was, and in that shared silence something unspoken passed between them. Not understanding, not agreement, but recognition. As if two very different lives had briefly crossed paths in a way that neither of them could reverse, and neither of them yet understood that this moment was only the beginning of a much larger unfolding that was already on its way toward them. The silence between Ava Johnson and the stranger had settled into something heavier than words, not uncomfortable, but filled with an unspoken awareness that neither of them fully understood. Ava remained close enough to feel his presence without invading his space. Watching as his breathing became more consistent and his posture slowly steadied against the brick wall. The city beyond the alley continued to move with its usual urgency, headlights sweeping across the wet pavement and distant voices blending into a constant hum. But inside the narrow space where they sat, everything felt slowed down, almost detached from time itself. The man shifted slightly and looked at Ava again, his expression now more alert than before, as if the earlier confusion had begun to clear. He asked her quietly if she had ever thought about leaving this place. The question lingered in the air longer than expected because it was not something she had heard often in a sincere way. Ava glanced toward the entrance of the alley where the glow of streetlights framed the movement of passing silhouettes, then looked back at him and said honestly that she had thought about it before, but thinking and doing were two very different things when survival took up most of a person's energy. The man listened carefully, not interrupting, and there was a subtle change in his eyes. Again, something like realization forming in layers rather than all at once. He adjusted his position slightly, pressing his back more firmly against the wall, and for a moment he closed his eyes as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, he spoke in a quieter tone, asking her what she believed people usually overlooked about life on the streets. Ava hesitated briefly because the question was not simple, but after a moment she said that most people assumed there was nothing there worth noticing, that everyone in her situation was just background noise in a city that was always moving forward. She said it without anger, more like a fact she had learned through experience. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands as if processing her words in a way that felt personal rather than distant. Ava noticed a slight tension in his expression, not discomfort but reflection, like something he had never considered was now sitting directly in front of him. A few seconds passed before he spoke again, this time asking her if she had ever been given a chance that changed anything for her. Ava thought about it and slowly shook her head, saying that chances did not usually come in the form of big moments. Sometimes they did not come at all. The man exhaled softly and looked toward the street again, his gaze more focused now, less distant than before, as if he was seeing the world outside the alley differently than he had earlier. Ava followed his line of sight briefly and noticed a group of people walking past the entrance, laughing, talking, completely unaware of the small world unfolding just a few steps away from them. She looked back at him and saw that he was still watching them, but not in the same way as before. There was something in his expression that suggested he was no longer just observing, but reevaluating, as if each passing second was adding clarity to something he had never taken the time to see. The man finally spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that felt different from earlier conversations. He said that sometimes the world only made sense when you stopped expecting it to treat everyone equally. Ava did not respond immediately because the statement felt both true and incomplete at the same time. Instead, she simply stayed where she was, present and steady, unaware that the quiet space they occupied was about to be disrupted by something neither of them could yet anticipate. The quiet rhythm inside the alley shifted slightly as Ava Johnson and the stranger remained seated in the same fragile space between uncertainty and understanding. The night air growing colder as the hours slowly passed, and the city beyond them continued its relentless motion. Ava pulled her knees closer to her chest for warmth, trying not to let the cold distract her from the steady, but still recovering breathing of the man beside her. He had become more stable now, his movements less uncertain, and his gaze carried a sharper awareness than before, as if the fog that had surrounded him earlier was gradually lifting. He turned his head toward Ava again and studied her for a few seconds before speaking in a calm but thoughtful tone, asking her what she thought kindness meant in a world that rarely seemed fair. The question felt heavier than the previous ones, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it forced her to think about something she usually just acted on without defining. Ava looked down at her hands for a moment, then answered quietly that kindness was not something she had the luxury to analyze. It was just what people did when they chose not to ignore each other, even when ignoring was easier. The man listened carefully, his expression tightening slightly, as if her answer carried more meaning than she realized. He shifted again, sitting a little straighter against the wall, and for the first time there was a subtle sense of urgency in his movements. Not panic but awareness, like someone reconnecting with reality after being away from it for too long. Ava noticed this change, but did not comment on it. She simply stayed present, allowing him to gather his thoughts. A few seconds later, he looked toward the entrance of the alley again, his eyes now more focused, tracking movement beyond the shadows. Ava followed his gaze and noticed that the flow of people outside seemed slightly different, more organized, more alert, though she could not immediately understand why. The man's breathing slowed as he focused on something unseen from her perspective. Then he spoke again, his voice lower than before but clearer, asking her if she had ever heard of people disappearing in plain sight simply because no one paid attention to them. Ava frowned slightly at the question, not fully understanding its direction, and said that she thought that was just how life worked for people like her. The man did not respond right away. Instead, he looked down for a moment and then back at her, his expression now carrying a complexity that was harder to read, as if he was weighing something important internally. Ava felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere again, like the space around them had become more tense without any visible cause. She turned her head slightly toward the street and noticed faint movement that seemed more coordinated than random pedestrians, distant reflections of light catching on dark surfaces, but still nothing fully clear. When she looked back at the man, she saw that he was now fully alert, his earlier weakness still present but no longer defining him. He spoke quietly, almost as if confirming something to himself, saying that sometimes the world waited until the exact moment you least expected to reveal what had been hidden. Ava did not fully understand what he meant, but before she could ask, a distant sound of approaching engines began to grow from the far end of the street, subtle at first, but steadily becoming more distinct. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened, and Ava, sensing the change without knowing its cause, instinctively became more still. The alley that had felt isolated only moments before now seemed like the center of something larger approaching from outside. Though neither of them yet knew what was about to arrive, the distant sound that Ava Johnson had noticed began to grow rapidly, transforming the quiet rhythm of the night into something more intense and structured, as if the street itself was responding to an unseen signal. She stayed completely still beside the stranger, her eyes fixed toward the entrance of the alley where faint reflections of headlights began to multiply across the wet pavement. The man beside her straightened slightly, his earlier weakness still present but now overshadowed by alertness. His gaze locked forward with a focus that Ava had not seen before. The sound of engines became clearer, no longer distant but approaching with deliberate control rather than random movement. Ava felt a shift in the atmosphere, not fear exactly, but a rising awareness that something significant was unfolding just beyond their line of sight. She looked at the stranger, but he was no longer looking at her. His attention was fully directed toward the street, as if he recognized something in the sound that she could not interpret. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them now filled with anticipation. Then the first set of headlights appeared at the end of the street, bright and steady, followed by another and another, forming a coordinated line that moved with precision rather than chaos. Ava instinctively leaned slightly forward to see better, her heart rate increasing as the number of vehicles became clearer. The man exhaled slowly, almost like he had been waiting for this exact moment, and in a calm but firm voice he said that they had found him. Ava did not understand immediately what he meant, but before she could ask, the first vehicle turned into the street and came to a controlled stop near the alley entrance, followed by others that aligned behind it in a formation that felt intentional and organized. Ava counted quickly in her mind. 1, 2, then more than she could keep track of as the street began to fill with dark vehicles that reflected the city lights across their polished surfaces. The sound of doors opening followed almost instantly, not chaotic but synchronized, and figures in formal attire began to step out. Ava instinctively moved a little closer to the stranger without realizing it, her body reacting before her thoughts could fully process what she was seeing. The man beside her remained composed, though his expression had fully changed now, carrying a recognition that felt grounded and certain. One of the figures from the lead vehicle approached the alley entrance and paused briefly as if confirming location, then gave a subtle signal. More people began to move forward with purpose. Ava noticed how different this felt compared to anything she had ever seen in this part of the city. There was no confusion or randomness in their movement, only coordination and intent. The stranger finally spoke again, this time in a calm voice that carried a sense of authority she had not heard before, saying that he had been trying to avoid attention, but it seemed that was no longer possible. Ava looked at him, still trying to process everything, and asked quietly if they were here for him. He nodded slightly without taking his eyes off the approaching group. The alley that had felt isolated and quiet only moments ago now felt like a space that had been discovered by something much larger. Ava's mind struggled to connect the man she had been helping with the situation unfolding in front of her, and before she could form another question, the first of the formally dressed individuals stepped closer into the alley light and spoke the man's name with clear recognition and respect, and in that instant the entire situation shifted in a way Ava could not yet fully understand. As the reality of who she had been sitting beside began to emerge from the shadows of the night the moment the man's name was spoken aloud in the alley, everything seemed to pause in a way that Ava Johnson could feel but not fully understand. The group of formally dressed individuals stood in a precise formation just beyond the entrance, their attention directed entirely toward the man she had been sitting beside for what felt like hours. Ava instinctively straightened her posture, suddenly aware of how small she felt in comparison to the unfolding scene. The stranger beside her remained composed, but now there was a clear shift in his presence, as if the weight he had been carrying earlier had transformed into something more structured and controlled. One of the men stepped forward slightly and repeated the name with certainty, addressing him as Mr. William Whitmore. The sound of it changed everything in Ava's perception. In an instant, the quiet, injured man she had been helping no longer fit into the reality she had constructed around him. Ava's eyes moved between the stranger and the group approaching, trying to process the contradiction between what she had seen and what she was now hearing. William Whitmore slowly shifted his position, not in weakness but in transition, as if returning to a role he had momentarily stepped away from. He looked at Ava for a brief moment, and there was something calm in his expression, something almost reassuring despite the intensity of the situation around them. One of the men from the group spoke again, confirming that they had secured the area and that he was safe now. Ava remained silent, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. She had been speaking to someone who now seemed to belong to a completely different world. The formal group created a clear boundary in the alley, separating Ava from the unfolding situation in front of her, yet no one treated her as invisible anymore. Several of the individuals briefly looked toward her, noticing her presence for the first time with recognition rather than indifference. William turned slightly toward her again and spoke in a calm voice that carried a deeper clarity than before, saying that she did not need to be afraid. Ava did not respond immediately, because fear was not exactly what she was feeling. It was more like displacement, as if the ground she had been standing on had shifted without warning. The man who had been weak and quiet only moments ago now appeared fully integrated into the presence of the people around him. One of the attendants stepped closer and carefully checked on him, speaking in a respectful tone while another motioned toward the vehicles waiting outside the alley. Ava watched everything carefully, still trying to understand her place in it. William then turned back to the group and gave a brief instruction in a steady voice. Not loud, but immediately obeyed. The coordination around him tightened as the people responded without hesitation. Ava noticed how quickly the environment adapted to his presence. Like a system reactivating after being paused, William's attention returned to her once more, and for a moment the noise of the street and the movement of the group seemed to fade into the background. He looked at her not with distance, but with something closer to acknowledgement, as if recognizing a moment that carried more significance than it appeared on the surface. Ava stood slowly, unsure whether she should move closer or step back, but no one stopped her or directed her away. Instead, there was a quiet respect in the way the group allowed her space. William finally spoke again, saying her name clearly and thanking her for what she had done. The words were simple but carried a weight that made Ava pause, because no one had spoken to her like that in a very long time. And in that moment, surrounded by vehicles, security, and unfamiliar authority, she began to realize that the night she thought was ordinary had already crossed into something far beyond anything she had ever experienced. The alley remained filled with quiet movement, as Ava Johnson stood slightly apart from the group of formally dressed individuals, her eyes still fixed on William Whitmore as he fully transitioned into the center of their attention. The atmosphere had changed completely from the earlier silence of uncertainty to a structured and controlled environment that Ava could feel but not fully interpret. William stood calmly as the people around him adjusted their positions, speaking in low but efficient tones that suggested coordination and familiarity. Ava noticed how quickly everything had reorganized around him, as if his presence naturally restored order to the situation. One of the attendants briefly confirmed his condition while another stepped aside to open a clear path toward the waiting vehicles. Ava remained still, unsure whether she should move or simply observe. William then turned toward her again, and this time his expression carried a level of clarity that had not been there before. He spoke her name once more, slowly and intentionally, as if making sure it would not be forgotten. Ava responded with a small nod, but did not know what to say in return. The contrast between the world she had known minutes ago and the one unfolding now felt too large to process at once. William raised his hand slightly in a subtle gesture, and the surrounding group paused their movements briefly, giving him full attention. He then spoke to them in a calm voice, giving instructions that Ava could not fully understand but clearly carried authority. The group responded immediately without hesitation, creating a structured space around both of them. Ava felt the attention shift again, and for the first time she realized that she was no longer being ignored. Several of the individuals now looked at her with recognition and curiosity rather than indifference. William stepped slightly closer to her and spoke in a softer tone, telling her that she did not need to remain in the alley any longer. Ava looked around briefly, taking in the vehicles, the people, and the controlled environment that had suddenly replaced the emptiness she was used to. She asked quietly what was going to happen now, her voice steady but uncertain. William paused for a moment before answering, saying that things were already in motion and that she would not be left alone. The simplicity of his words carried a weight that made Ava remain silent for a moment. She had spent so much of her life expecting to be overlooked that the idea of someone ensuring she would not be felt unfamiliar. One of the attendants approached with a respectful posture, offering assistance in a careful and controlled manner, but William raised his hand slightly, signaling for them to wait. His attention remained on Ava, and for a brief moment the surrounding activity seemed to slow, as if the space between them had become the center of everything that mattered in that moment. Ava looked at him again, noticing the difference in how he now carried himself compared to when she first saw him lying quietly in the alley. The change was complete, yet still connected to the same person she had chosen to help without hesitation. William finally spoke again, his voice calm and steady, telling her that what she had done earlier was not something he would forget. Ava did not respond immediately, because she was still trying to understand how a single decision could lead to something so large and unfamiliar. The group around them remained respectful and silent, waiting for his next instruction. And in that suspended moment, Ava Johnson stood at the center of a situation that had completely transformed in less than an hour, without yet realizing that the next decision would determine the course of everything that followed. The atmosphere in the alley had fully shifted from confusion to controlled movement, as Ava Johnson remained standing slightly apart from the organized group surrounding William Whitmore, her eyes quietly tracking everything as if she were still trying to confirm that this was not something her mind had created out of exhaustion. William turned slightly toward her again, and the way he looked at her carried a calm certainty that contrasted sharply with the chaos of thoughts still forming inside Ava's head. He gave a subtle gesture toward one of the attendants, who immediately stepped back to maintain distance, creating a respectful space around them. Ava noticed how no one interrupted him or questioned his attention on her, as if his focus alone had already defined her importance in this moment. William spoke again in a steady voice, telling her that what had happened earlier was not something ordinary or forgettable. Ava listened without speaking, her hands still slightly tense at her sides. She was not used to being part of conversations where people waited for her reaction instead of ignoring her presence entirely. One of the attendants quietly approached from the side, but stopped when William raised his hand slightly, signaling patience. The group adjusted immediately, reinforcing the sense that everything in this space moved according to his direction. Ava looked briefly at the vehicles lined along the street, their dark surfaces reflecting the city lights in a way that made the entire scene feel unreal compared to the alley she had known only moments before. William then turned his attention fully back to her and asked a question that seemed simple but carried deep weight. He asked her what she wanted. Ava hesitated because no one had asked her that in a long time with any real expectation of an answer. She looked down at the ground for a moment before speaking honestly, saying she did not really know anymore. Her life had been focused on surviving each day, not planning for anything beyond it. William listened carefully without interruption, his expression remaining calm but thoughtful, as if each word she spoke was being taken seriously in a way she was not used to. The surrounding group stayed silent, giving space to the exchange between them. Ava felt the attention in the air again, not heavy or judgmental, but present in a way that made her aware she was no longer invisible. William nodded slowly after she finished speaking, then told her that surviving was not something she needed to do alone anymore. The simplicity of the statement carried a strength that made Ava pause. She had heard promises before in her life, but this one was not rushed or emotional. It felt structured, deliberate, and certain. She looked up at him, trying to understand what kind of meaning could exist behind words spoken so calmly in a situation so unfamiliar. William then instructed one of the attendants to prepare transport, and immediately the group began to move with coordinated efficiency, but he kept his attention on Ava as if making sure she understood that she was included in what was happening. Ava shifted slightly, unsure whether to follow or stay where she was, but William spoke again softly, saying she would not be left in the alley. The words were simple but firm, and for the first time in a long time Ava felt a strange hesitation that was not rooted in fear but in disbelief. The idea that someone had decided she did not have to remain where she had always been felt too large to accept. Instantly, as the group continued organizing around them and the night deepened, Ava stood at the center of a life that had just begun to change direction without warning, still unaware that every decision made in the next moments would carry consequences far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The night air outside the alley felt different now, as Ava Johnson stood quietly beside William Whitmore, surrounded by a controlled formation of vehicles and attendants who waited for his direction. With calm precision, the earlier confusion of the city had been replaced with a structured stillness that Ava could still not fully understand. William remained close to her side, not as someone being supported anymore, but as someone fully aware and present, his posture steady and his attention focused on her in a way that made her feel both seen and uncertain at the same time. One of the attendants opened a door to a nearby vehicle, but William did not move immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava and spoke in a calm and steady voice, telling her that she did not need to return to the place she had been staying. The words were simple, but they carried a meaning that made her pause. Ava glanced toward the street where she had spent so many nights before. The corner, the alley, the cardboard, all of it suddenly felt distant even though it was still physically close. She did not respond right away because the idea of leaving it behind so quickly felt unfamiliar. William continued, saying that what she had done earlier was not something that would be forgotten and that she would not be left without support. Ava listened carefully, trying to process what support even meant in a situation like this. She had learned to expect nothing beyond each passing day, and now she was being told that her next days would not look the same. The attendants remained respectfully still, waiting for William's decision, as if every movement in the scene depended on his final instruction. Ava finally asked quietly where she would go, her voice soft but steady. William answered without hesitation, saying she would come with them and that she would be safe. The word safe felt strange to Ava, not because she did not understand it, but because she was not used to hearing it directed toward her as a certainty. She looked up at him, searching for any sign that this might change again into something temporary. But his expression remained calm and consistent, without pressure or urgency. One of the attendants stepped forward slightly and spoke in a respectful tone, confirming arrangements that were already prepared. But William raised his hand gently, signaling that the decision did not need to be rushed. Ava noticed this and felt a subtle shift, as if she was being given time rather than being directed. She looked again toward the street, then back toward the group, and for the first time in a long time, She felt the weight of choice in a way she was not used to, not a choice about survival for the next hour, but about what came after. William spoke once more, saying that she had already shown who she was by what she chose to do earlier that night, and that now it was his turn to make sure she was not left behind because of where she had started. Ava stood still for a moment, the sounds of the city continuing around them, but feeling distant. The vehicles, the attendants, the calm authority of William Whitmore all formed a reality that was still settling into her understanding. Slowly, she took a small step forward, not fully certain, but no longer staying in place. And as she did, the group gently adjusted to her movement, opening space without pressure. William nodded slightly, and for the first time that night, Ava Johnson began to move forward into a direction she had never imagined for herself, still unaware that the choice she was making would redefine everything that came after.